Hey everyone, welcome back to Sci-Fi Short Chronicles. Today, we've got a thrilling story that explores the unexpected journey of the mini alien girl. She's from another world, and she feared that humans would try to mate with her, until she discovers something totally shocking. What happens next? You'll have to stick around to find out. If you're a fan of HFY stories and want to dive into more exciting sci-fi adventures, don't forget to like this video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on the latest content. Your support helps us bring more wild stories to life. Let's get into it. The wind whispered through the dense forest, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp leaves and moss. Irina stood motionless among the towering trees, her heart pounding so fiercely it felt as if it might burst through her chest. She clutched the small satchel hanging from her shoulder, her emerald skin glowing faintly in the dim light of Earth's moon. Her large, luminous eyes darted nervously from shadow to shadow, ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. She had read the stories, heard the warnings. Humans were dangerous, unpredictable creatures who would stop at nothing to capture alien women like her. Her breath hitched as she stepped over a root, the rustle of her movement echoing too loudly in her ears. She cursed herself silently for her decision to come here. Her curiosity had overpowered the wisdom of her people. They had warned her against Earth, warned her about the humans, but the pull to explore the unknown had been too strong. Now stranded and alone in this foreign wilderness, she felt the weight of her mistake crushing her. The ship's crash had been violent, tearing through the atmosphere like a wounded animal. She had barely managed to eject herself before the vessel crumpled into a fiery heap. Her escape pod had landed her safely, but the crash site was far too dangerous to linger near. The fire and smoke would surely attract attention. Human attention. A sudden noise snapped her out of her thoughts. Footsteps. Irina froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound grew louder, deliberate. Someone or something was approaching. She pressed herself against the rough bark of a tree, her small frame trembling. Her fingers tightened around the satchel as she peered cautiously toward the sound. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and broad-shouldered. He was human. His clothes were rugged, a jacket frayed at the edges and boots caked with mud. His face, illuminated faintly by the moonlight, held an expression of curiosity rather than hostility. When his gaze fell on her, he stopped abruptly, his body stiffening. Irina's breath caught in her throat. This was it. He would capture her, perhaps drag her to one of the breeding camps where people had spoken of in hushed tones. But instead of charging toward her, the man slowly crouched down, lowering himself to her level. His movements were careful, non-threatening. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice low and soft. The words meant nothing to her. She couldn't understand his language. But the tone, it wasn't angry or commanding, it was gentle. Irina raised her hands, palms out, a universal gesture of submission. Her luminous eyes locked onto his, wide with fear. "It's okay," he said, his tone even softer now. He gestured to himself, tapping his chest. "I'm kin." She tilted her head slightly, trying to decipher his meaning. His name, perhaps? His calm demeanor was disarming, and for a moment her fear wavered. When she didn't respond, he reached into a pouch on his belt, pulling out a small packet. He tore it open, revealing a piece of bread, and held it out to her. Irina's stomach growled involuntarily. She hadn't eaten since before the crash. Still weary, she eyed the offering, her fingers twitching at her side. The man, Kin, didn't move, patiently holding the bread out to her. After a moment, she stepped forward cautiously, her bare feet silent against the forest floor. Her hands trembled as she reached out and took the bread, her gaze never leaving his. She sniffed at it first, then nibbled tentatively. It was dry and coarse, but her hunger overrode her distaste. As she ate, she noticed Kin watching her, his expression one of quiet fascination. He spoke again, his voice a soothing murmur. Though she couldn't understand a word, his hands moved as he spoke, gesturing in ways that seemed intended to explain something. Irina frowned, her mind racing to decode his meaning. She pointed to herself hesitantly. "Irina," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "Kalin," he smiled, nodding. "Ara," he repeated, his pronunciation clumsy but earnest. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps humans weren't all the monsters her people had painted them to be. The man gestured for her to follow him, pointing toward a trail winding deeper into the forest. Irina hesitated. Trusting a human was dangerous, foolish even. But the alternative was wandering alone in an unfamiliar world, vulnerable to its many threats. After a moment of deliberation, she nodded and fell into step behind him. The journey was slow, Colin careful to keep his pace steady so she could follow. He occasionally glanced back to ensure she was still there, offering her reassuring smiles that she didn't quite know how to interpret when they arrived at a small cabin nestled among the trees. Irina's curiosity piqued. The structure was simple but sturdy, its wooden walls weathered by time. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, and the faint glow of firelight spilled through a window. Kayin opened the door and stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. Irina hesitated on the threshold, her instincts warning her to stay cautious. But the warmth emanating from within was inviting, and she reluctantly stepped in. Inside, the cabin was modest, filled with mismatched furniture and the faint aroma of herbs and wood smoke. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Cullen moved to a table cluttered with various items, rummaging through a drawer until he produced a small blanket. He offered it to her with a smile. Irina took it hesitantly, wrapping it around her shoulders. The fabric was rough against her skin, but it provided welcome warmth. She watched as Callan moved about the cabin, lighting a lantern and setting a pot of water over the fire. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. She sat down on a worn chair, clutching the blanket tightly. Her gaze followed him as he prepared what appeared to be a meal, his actions methodical, yet oddly comforting. Over the next hour, they attempted to communicate using gestures and simple words. Irina picked up a few basic phrases, her own language blending awkwardly with his. Cullen was patient, repeating words and miming actions until she understood. As the evening wore on, her initial fear began to ebb. Cullen's kindness was genuine, his demeanour disarming. She found herself relaxing in his presence, though she remained vigilant. When she finally settled onto a makeshift bed in the corner of the cabin, exhaustion overcame her. As she drifted off to sleep, her thoughts swirled with questions. Were all humans like Cullen, or was he an exception? For the first time since her arrival on Earth, she allowed herself a sliver of hope. Perhaps the stories weren't entirely true. Perhaps humanity had more to offer than fear and danger. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Irina slept, her small frame curled beneath the blanket. And in the quiet of the cabin, a fragile bond began to form, a connection that would challenge everything she thought she knew about humans and herself. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the small window of the cabin, painting the wooden walls with streaks of gold. Irina stirred, her sensitive ears twitching at the sound of birds chirping outside. The warmth of the blanket and the soft crackling of dying embers in the hearth made her hesitate to rise. For a fleeting moment, she felt a sense of peace, a stark contrast to the fear that had gripped her the night before. The creak of the cabin door opening broke the stillness, and she sat up abruptly, her heart racing. Colin stepped inside, carrying a bundle of firewood in his arms. His eyes met hers, and he offered her a warm smile. "Morning," he said, his tone light and welcoming. Irina didn't understand the word, but the kindness in his voice was unmistakable. She nodded in acknowledgement, her own lips curving into a hesitant smile. Cullen set the firewood down near the hearth and gestured toward the pot hanging over the fire. The faint aroma of something savoury filled the air, and Irina's stomach growled softly. He chuckled at the sound, pointing to the pot, and then miming eating. "Food," he said clearly, tapping his lips. Irina repeated the word softly, testing it on her tongue. "Food." He nodded enthusiastically, pleased by her effort. Taking a bowl from the table, he ladled out a portion of the stew and handed it to her. She accepted it carefully, the warmth of the bowl seeping into her hands. The stew was simple, chunks of root vegetables and some kind of meat. But to Irina, it was a feast. She ate slowly, savouring each bite. As she did, she noticed Cullen watching her, his expression thoughtful. "You don't seem dangerous," he murmured to himself, then to her. Irina tilted her head, sensing the shift in his tone. Though the words were lost on her, the gentle cadence of his voice reassured her. After breakfast, Cullen motioned for her to follow him outside. She hesitated, her gaze darting to the dense forest that surrounded the cabin. The world beyond felt vast and unpredictable. But Cullen's steady presence gave her a thread of courage. He led her to a small clearing where a wooden bench sat beneath the shade of a towering oak tree. Nearby, a stream bubbled softly, its crystal-clear water sparkling in the sunlight. Cullen knelt by the stream, cupping his hands to drink, before gesturing for her to do the same. Irina approached cautiously, kneeling beside him. She mimicked his actions. The cool water was refreshing as it slid down her throat. For a moment she allowed herself to relax, the natural beauty of the surroundings easing her nerves. As the days passed, a routine began to form. Cullen taught her more words, pointing to objects and repeating their names until she could mimic them. In turn, she shared fragments of her own language, though it was clear he struggled with the unfamiliar sounds. Their bond grew slowly, built on small gestures and shared moments. Irina began to see Cullen not as a threat, but as a person, someone kind and patient, with a heart far removed from the cruel stories she had been told. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Cullen pulled out a small, battered notebook. The pages were filled with sketches and notes, his handwriting uneven but meticulous. He flipped to a drawing of what appeared to be a starship, its sleek design reminiscent of the vessels from her own world. "You came from up there, didn't you?" he asked, pointing into the sky. Irina nodded slowly, her gaze shifting to the window where the stars twinkled against the dark expanse of the night. She touched her chest, then pointed upward, mimicking the shape of a falling object with her hand. Cullen's brow furrowed as he tried to piece together her meaning. "You fell." She nodded again, her expression sombre. The crash had been more than a physical fall. It had been a descent into uncertainty and fear. Cullen's eyes softened and he reached out hesitantly, his hand hovering near hers. When she didn't pull away, he gently covered her hand with his own. The warmth of his touch startled her, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was comforting. "You're safe here," he said firmly. Though she couldn't understand the words, his tone carried the reassurance she needed. Irina stared at their joined hands, her heart aching with a mix of emotions. The humans she had been taught to fear were nothing like this man. He had shown her kindness, patience, and a capacity for understanding that she hadn't thought possible. As the firelight danced across the walls, she began to wonder if her people had been wrong about humans. Perhaps they weren't the cold, heartless beings she had been led to believe. But a shadow lingered in her mind. The council on her homeworld wouldn't see it that way. They had strict rules about interacting with humans, and her actions could have severe consequences. For now, though, she pushed those thoughts aside. In this small cabin, under the quiet watch of the stars, Irina felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, humans weren't the monsters she had feared. As days turned to weeks, the bond between Irina and Kalin deepened. Through shared meals, moments of laughter, and their continued exchange of languages, they grew to understand each other in ways that words alone couldn't capture. Irina found herself growing more at ease in his presence, and with that comfort came a sense of belonging she hadn't anticipated. Kalin had taken to showing her how he lived. He taught her to tend the small vegetable garden outside the cabin, guiding her hands as she learned to plant seeds and pull weeds. She marveled at the simplicity of the task and the patience it required. In her world, sustenance came from synthesized food and replicators, detached from the act of creation. Here, it felt personal, intimate, and alive. One afternoon, Kalin led her to the edge of the forest, where wildflowers bloomed in a riot of colours. He bent to pick a small bouquet, handing it to her with a sheepish grin. "For you," he said softly. Irina accepted the flowers, their delicate fragrance filling the air. Though she couldn't respond in his language, her smile spoke volumes. She tucked one of the blooms into her hair, earning an approving nod from Kalin. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Kalin pulled out a wooden instrument, a simple flute he had carved himself. He played a soft melody, the notes rising and falling like whispers carried on the wind. Irina listened, captivated by the haunting beauty of the tune. Music wasn't new to her. Her people had their own forms of expression. But Kalin's music felt raw and unpolished, a reflection of his emotions laid bare. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, and for a moment it felt as though they were connected on a level beyond words. Their connection, however, wasn't without its challenges. Irina still carried the weight of her people's teachings, the warnings that humans were dangerous and unpredictable. And while Kalin had shown her nothing but kindness, she couldn't ignore the fear that lingered in the corners of her mind. One night, as they sat together, she decided to confront her doubts. Using the fragments of his language she had learned, she pointed to him and asked hesitantly, "Why kind?" Kalin tilted his head, surprised by the question. "Why am I kind?" he repeated, as if confirming he understood. She nodded, her gaze searching his face for answers. He set down the knife he had been using to whittle a piece of wood and leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Because it's right," he said simply. "You're not my enemy. You're just someone who needs help." Irina furrowed her brow, struggling to grasp the meaning. She tapped her chest, then pointed to him. "Me enemy?" He shook his head firmly. "Number never." His answer eased some of her tension, but it also stirred something deeper. If humans like Kalin could be this compassionate, how many of her people's assumptions about humanity were based on fear rather than truth? As she pondered this, Kalin spoke again, his voice gentle. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Irina. I'll protect you, no matter what." The sincerity in his words resonated with her. Even if she didn't understand every nuance, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand, in a silent gesture of gratitude. But their fragile peace was not destined to last. Late one night, Irina awoke to the sound of distant voices, gruff and unfamiliar. Her heart pounded as she crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. Torches flickered in the distance, and the shadows of several figures loomed just beyond the tree line. She hurried to wake Kalin, shaking his shoulder until his eyes snapped open. "Danger!" she whispered urgently, pointing toward the forest. Kalin was on his feet in an instant, his expression hardening as he grabbed a small bow and quiver from the corner of the room. He moved to the window, his jaw tightening as he took in the approaching figures. "They must have followed the crash," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "They're looking for you." Irina's blood ran cold. The Council must have sent a retrieval team to capture her, or worse, eliminate her to prevent any chance of human interference. Callan turned to her, his eyes sharp but determined. "Stay here," he instructed. Though he knew she might not understand, he mimed the action, pressing his hands down as if to tell her to remain hidden. Irina shook her head vehemently, grabbing his arm. "No, together." Though her words were halting, her intent was clear. Cullen hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but stay close." They slipped out of the cabin through the back door, moving silently into the forest. Cullen led her along a narrow path, his steps deliberate as he avoided snapping twigs or rustling leaves. Irina followed closely, her heightened senses alert to every sound. The voices grew louder and Irina's heart raced. She could understand fragments of their language, orders being barked, mentions of alien presence and containment. Colin motioned for her to hide behind a fallen log while he scouted ahead. She obeyed, crouching low as she watched him disappear into the shadows. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When Colin returned, his expression was grim. "They're armed," he whispered, "but I think I can distract them long enough for you to escape." Irina's eyes widened in alarm. "No, not leave." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "Irina, if they catch you—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "You're safer away from here." Tears pricked her eyes, but she shook her head stubbornly. "Together," she insisted again. Carlin sighed, his resolve faltering. "You're too stubborn for your own good," he muttered, though there was a hint of admiration in his tone. They moved cautiously, weaving through the trees as they tried to put distance between themselves and the search party. But the voices grew closer, and Irina's heart sank. There were too many of them, and they were closing in fast. Suddenly, a bright beam of light pierced through the darkness, illuminating their hiding spot. "There!" a voice shouted. Kaylin grabbed Irina's hand and pulled her into a sprint. Adrenaline surged through her veins as they ran, the sound of footsteps and shouts echoing behind them. She didn't know where they were going, only that she trusted Carlin to lead her to safety. But safety felt like a fleeting dream as the pursuers gained ground. Irina's chest burned, her legs aching as she pushed herself to keep up. In the chaos, one thought kept repeating in her mind. She couldn't let them take her. Not now. Not after she had discovered the truth about humans, their capacity for kindness, for love. Not after she had discovered Kaylin. As the forest rushed by in a blur of shadows and frantic movement, Irina's heart pounded louder than her breath. Each step, a desperate attempt to outrun the approaching danger. The beams of light from the human searchers sliced through the trees, their harsh glow now dangerously close. Irina felt a rush of fear, but she couldn't let it consume her. Not when Kaylin was right beside her, urging her forward with a fierce determination she hadn't seen before. They rounded a corner of the forest path, the sound of the pursuit echoing closer. When a sudden realization hit her. This chase wasn't just about survival. It was about the life she was trying to build here with him on Earth, away from her people's cruel expectations. She couldn't lose that. Not now, when she had seen such kindness in him. Kaylin glanced over at her, his face etched with concern, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes. "We need to make it to the river," he urged, his voice low, like it was some secret escape route. The river was a mile away, and even though Irina's body ached, she nodded, knowing they had no choice but to keep going. The voices of their pursuers grew louder now, just a few 100 yards away, their lights sweeping the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Kaylin pulled her forward, his grip on her arm a steady anchor in the chaos. For a moment, she was terrified. What if they didn't make it? What if the humans chasing them were like the ones she had feared, the ones who wouldn't show mercy? But Carlin's presence next to her was a constant reminder that not all humans were the same. Not all of them would hunt her down because of her origins. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to stop running. "Stay close," Kalin said, his voice tight with urgency as he led her to a steep embankment that descended toward the river. At that moment, the first beam of light caught them both. The pursuers were just a few steps away. Irina's heart lurched, but Carlin's voice was steady as he quickly threw himself in front of her. "Go," he commanded, and though his words were simple, they were filled with everything that he had ever wanted to say: fear, hope, and an unwavering trust that she could survive this. Irina didn't hesitate. Her legs moved on their own as she sprinted down the embankment toward the river. She could hear the shouts of the pursuers behind them, but they didn't matter anymore. The river was their only chance. As she neared the water, she felt her heart skip. Carlin wasn't right behind her. She turned around only to find him still standing at the edge of the trees, facing the incoming humans. His arms were raised as though to buy her time. The harsh lights illuminated his face, and for a brief second she saw the determination in his eyes, the willingness to protect her no matter the cost. "No!" Irina cried instinctively, pulling away from the water's edge. But before she could take another step, Carlin shouted her name one last time. "Go!" A final command that resonated deep in her soul. With a sob of anguish, Irina dove into the river, the cool water closing overhead as she fought to swim against the current. She glanced back to see Carlin still standing on the riverbank's dim light, his figure growing distant until he disappeared into the shadows of the trees. For hours, Irina fought the current. Her body was sore, her heart heavy, with both fear and an unshakable drive to survive. But she couldn't stop. She needed to find safety. She needed to get back to him. Eventually, as the first rays of dawn began to touch the sky, Irina managed to pull herself to the opposite bank. She lay there, drenched and trembling, trying to catch her breath. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but all she could focus on was one thing. She had to return to him. With an effort that felt like it took all of her remaining strength, she pushed herself up and began the long, agonizing journey back. She couldn't let him face them alone. After what felt like an eternity, Irina stumbled out of the forest and into the clearing where their cabin lay. A sense of quiet finally settling over her. The house stood undisturbed, the door still open from when they had fled the night before. Her heart raced as she entered, calling his name in a shaky voice. But the house was empty. Frantic, she searched through every room, growing more desperate with each empty corner. But then, as she reached the back door, she froze. There, standing just outside, was Kalin. He was battered, his clothes torn, but his eyes, those eyes that had been so full of fear and hope just days ago, were now filled with something else, a quiet kind of relief. "You?" Irina whispered, her voice breaking. Carlin smiled softly, though there was an unmistakable weariness in his expression. "I knew you'd come back." He stepped forward, taking her hand in his, the touch grounding her in the moment. Irina stared at him in awe, her mind struggling to comprehend the risks he had taken to protect her. "You shouldn't have," she whispered. "I had to," he said simply, his voice gentle. "You matter more than anything else." Tears welled up in her eyes as she stepped closer, her hands trembling as she cupped his face. "I didn't want to be alone." She confessed the weight of everything she had been carrying coming to the surface. "You're never alone," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "Not as long as I'm here." In that moment, Irina realized that no matter the dangers that would come, no matter the uncertainty that still loomed, she had found a place where she belonged, with him. And for the first time in her life, she knew what it felt like to be loved, to be cherished, and to love in return. The Alien Council could never understand her choice, but for Irina, it didn't matter anymore. She had found her home, not among her own people, but in the heart of a human who saw her as more than an alien. They embraced each other under the rising sun, the warmth of their shared silence speaking louder than any words could ever express. The world outside still held dangers, but for now it didn't matter. Together, they had found their own kind of peace.